So I'm going to talk about a topic here that is kind of sensitive. In my experience, it's probably one of the most challenging aspects of the spiritual path. It was for myself. It took me many years to break through and realize what I'm going to talk about here, and I've seen other people struggle with it for a long time too. So if you're going to get the most out of watching this video, I need you to kind of step back a little bit and not focus all of your attention on what I'm saying. You have to have some attention on your own reaction. And you have to watch what's coming up from inside yourself, perhaps some feelings, perhaps some thoughts, where you might have some raw fear come up that's triggered by what I'm saying, and you might have some sense of shame or guilt. You might have some thoughts about, arguing against what I'm saying. And you may also, if you're paying attention, you may also feel a certain energy, a certain projection of thoughts coming from the outside. That is basically directed at getting you to reject what I'm saying. Because there's an enormous force in the world, in the collective consciousness, that wants you to reject what I'm going to say here. And what I'm going to say is very, very simple. It is that when you truly grasp what the spiritual path is all about, you cannot go wrong on the spiritual path. You cannot make a mistake on the spiritual path. The spiritual path is the one endeavor on earth where we cannot go wrong. We cannot make a mistake. And so monitor your reaction here. Feelings, thoughts, projections from the outside. If you look at the history of religion, you will see that the vast majority of religions are and have been fear-based religions. And that means that there's always been this element of the fear of something. And you can take the typical Christian religion, the fear of going to hell. I mean, if you go back in time, you will see that there was a time where people were living very, very poor lives. The vast majority of the population were virtually the slaves of the noble class in the feudal societies. They were living very poor lives. They had really not much to look forward to. And the Christian religion, the Catholic Church, didn't give them any hope that they could improve their position in life. So the only appeal that the Christian religion had was the hope that they would be better off after this life when they went to heaven. But of course, what was motivating them to seek to go to heaven and go to church was the fear that if they didn't go to church, if they didn't follow the Christian religion, they were sure to burn in hell for all eternity. So you see right there, totally fear-based message. Now, if you, on the other hand, look at Jesus himself and the message Jesus gave, it was not a fear-based message. Jesus gave a love-based message. But the Christian religion, starting especially with the Catholic Church, turned it into a fear-based message, as was the Jewish religion. The Old Testament God, the angry God in the sky, who wants to be obeyed, and if he's not obeyed, he will send you to hell. Again, fear-based. Islam, fear-based. Many Hindus, they're so afraid of karma, also fear-based. Then you have the entire spiritual, whatever we want to call it, phenomenon, culture, New Age, spirituality. Also there's a certain element of fear. There can be a fear of what's going to happen in the world. There can be a fear that you can make a mistake. And you just see it over and over, how there are certain gurus that play upon people's fears. And how they manage to get people to do things out of fear of something is going to happen, either to them personally or to the world. And there is that fear, there's an underlying fear of failure. In my second spiritual movement, there was this idea that every situation we encounter is a test. And there was always the fear that you could fail your test, you could fail your initiations. And you see the same thing in many spiritual movements that have this idea that there's a spiritual path we are walking, and there are certain initiations we have to pass at each step of this spiritual path. And if we fail, then not only either we won't make the progress we can make, or we will actually go backwards, and then something could happen. Whatever it may be individually in a movement. I just was reading yesterday about my first spiritual movement was a meditation movement, and I didn't at the time experience it as fear-based, but maybe that was just because I was young and didn't notice, but I do remember there was talk about how we could improve the world by meditating. But I just read that shortly after I left, the leader of the movement had said that if people didn't uproot their lives and move to the headquarters of the movement in America and meditate more, then there would be all these calamities that would happen in the world, and it would basically be their fault. So you see the same thing in my second spiritual movement. We had these technique called decreeing, where we would decree, repeat these verses at very high speed. And part of it was that we were decreeing for improvement of the world to avoid a nuclear war, for example. Again, I didn't see that as fear-based, but I know that many people certainly did. And many people went into a very fear-based reaction and started building bomb shelters, nuclear bomb shelters, and so forth and so on. So what I'm saying here, there is this very, very old momentum on Earth that it's like it has two aspects. In the religious aspect of it is that you absolutely have to stay within this particular religion, because there's only one true religion, there's only one religion that leads to salvation. So you absolutely have to stay there, otherwise you're going to go to hell. But of course, in the spiritual realm, spiritual scenario, people have already left one of the traditional religions, otherwise you wouldn't be spiritual. But there can still be that fear-based scenario that you are walking a spiritual path, but you could fail your tests, fail your initiations. And you could still, in whatever way it's described, go wrong. And this is what I am challenging in this video, because I realized, and it took me quite some time, but I realized that this is a completely unrealistic view of the spiritual path. It's actually based on failing to understand what the spiritual path is all about. And I'm not blaming people. I'm not blaming people, because it is difficult to grasp what the spiritual path is really about. And it certainly isn't something that's easy to understand. But I will say that there are, of course, teachers out there who do not explain this. And so the question is why? Either they are deliberately withholding the information from people because they want to keep them in that state of fear that they could make a mistake, or they just don't understand it themselves. So I'm going to try to explain it here. And if we want to be very boil it down sort of to the essence of it, you can say that what is the spiritual path all about? What is it really about? And the essence of the spiritual path is that you come to the realization that nothing on earth defines you. You are a spiritual being. You originated in the spiritual realm. You descended to earth. You have taken on an outer personality and a physical body. But these are just vehicles through which you are expressing yourself in the world. the material world on earth, you are interacting with the environment, you're co-creating in the environment. And it's perfectly fine that you have come to identify yourself as a being who's defined by all of these things in the outer personality, in the world, and this and that. It's perfectly fine. I've given the model that the earth can be compared to a reality simulator. We have two kinds of experiences. First, the immersion experience. And in the immersion experience, we go into the physical body, the emotional, mental, and identity bodies. We create all these outer personality, even these separate selves, and we identify ourselves as that. And that's perfectly fine. That's immersion. But the spiritual path is when we start awakening, which is the other phase in the reality simulator, the awakening experience. And in awakening, we come to realize that, oh, I am not this physical body. I am not my emotions. I'm not my thoughts. I'm not my sense of identity. I'm not all of these separate selves that I have created as a reaction to these very difficult, very traumatic conditions I've experienced on earth. So basically, you can say that the spiritual path is a process where the real you, which I've called the conscious you, realizes, I'm not this, I'm not that, I'm not the next thing. Because what I've also explained in several other videos is that the core of our beings is what I call the conscious you. And the conscious you is pure awareness, which doesn't mean it's undifferentiated awareness, because it still has an individual sense of self, a vantage point from which it's looking at the world. But it's not the outer personality. It's not what you have defined in your identity body. I'm a human being. I was born here. I belong to this race. I belong to this ethnic group. I belong to this nationality, this religion. All of these things. It's not your thoughts, how you think you need to react to the world or relate to the world. It's not your feelings, what you think you need to feel in certain situations. And it's certainly not your physical body. So basically the spiritual path is that you have descended, you have gone into immersion, which is perfectly fine. It's what we are meant to do on earth. But the spiritual path is when you reawaken yourself from immersion and you return to this state of pure awareness that you descended with. And interestingly, even though many spiritual people ignore Jesus, he actually said this 2,000 years ago. He said, the only person who can ascend back to heaven is the one who descended from heaven. So in other words, the conscious you descended in this pure state where you were not identified with, you didn't feel you were defined by anything on earth. And the only way to escape earth, escape suffering, and ascend back to the spiritual realm is to come back to that state of innocence, that state of purity, that state of not being identified with anything on earth. And once you grasp this, that is when you can make this shift that it took me a long time to make, of suddenly realizing, but you can't really do anything wrong then on the spiritual path. Because whatever you do can be turned into a step closer to that pure state, to the innocence. Because you can come to see something. You can come to realize something. I'm not that. So, just to take an example, I mean, when I was new to the spiritual path and I was 18 years old, I had in me a certain fear of following a false guru. And I met many spiritual people who have the same thing. And I'm not saying all people have it, but certainly many people I have met have had this fear of following a false guru. And I think it goes back from past lives. I have a couple of videos where I talk about false gurus, and one where I'm answering a question about false gurus. And I say that there are false gurus, they are the fallen beings. And you really can't grasp the concept of false gurus unless you understand the fallen beings and what their goal is. To basically, their goal is really to prevent us from awakening, from prevent us from even starting the path of awakening from immersion. They want us to stay immersed as they are. So we have no doubt as spiritual people encountered false gurus in a past lifetime. I also have my avatar series where I talk about many spiritual people have come to Earth from a natural planet and we were attacked, traumatized by the fallen beings who tried to destroy us and destroy what our potential is to do on Earth, which is pull the planet up. So there's no doubt we have encountered these false gurus. So I think many spiritual people, they have not a conscious memory, but you have a certain sense, you can't follow a false guru. You have to be very careful who you follow. So here we are, as I've said, we grow up in a non-spiritual society. We are taught more about how to select shampoo than how to select a spiritual guru. So we just have to basically experiment. I mean, we are the pioneers, So there weren't, if you go back a few years, there weren't as many gurus available. So it's natural people are attracted to some kind of guru. And many people I met on the spiritual path, they were attracted to a particular guru, often an Eastern guru. The further you go back, the smaller selection there was of Western gurus. And then they later, after some time, came to realize that there was something missing. And perhaps they even came to say that was a false guru. And many people I met have been really traumatized by this because they felt they had given the trust to the guru and the guru had betrayed their trust. And I understand this reaction. I'm not trying to make light of it. No. There are obviously false gurus who are abusing people, who are abusing their trust. I'm not trying to in any way excuse this here. I'm not excusing behavior that is clearly destructive for people. But what I am saying is, if you've been exposed to this scenario, the essential question for you is, how do I move on? How do I avoid letting a mistake I made stop my path, stop my awakening process? How do I avoid this? And you may have to go through some steps, of saying this was abuse, saying this was wrong, saying you were betrayed. You may have to talk to other people who felt the same. And you may have to go through what they call basically a grieving process, which then becomes a healing process. I'm not saying there aren't steps you might need to take. But what I'm talking about here is this switch where you realize that even though this might have happened, you can still turn it into a positive on your spiritual path because you can learn from it. But now here comes an important consideration. And again, this took me a long time to get. I remember, as I've described before, I found my first spiritual movement. I was 18, it was a meditation movement, it was an Eastern guru. And again, it doesn't matter who it was for this discussion. So after some years, I came to see that this guru didn't have any spiritual light, that he had basically misled people. And so I don't think I had that term back then, or maybe I did. Maybe I did call him a false guru. But it took me a while to admit this because I didn't want to admit that I could have been wrong. And part of it was that I felt I had intuitively been guided to join that movement, and now it had turned out it was a false guru, so that meant I had been wrong. And my intuition had given me a wrong direction. And this scared me because what could I rely on if not my intuition? But there was also a certain outer thing, which was that there was a part of my mind that didn't want to admit it had been wrong. And this followed me as I found my second spiritual movement, which, as I said, had this idea of you could fail your tests. And so I didn't want to admit that I had failed the test or that I had been wrong. But I got myself into some situations in the second spiritual movement where I was in conflict with some leaders in the movement, not the top level leaders, but sort of the medium level leaders. And it came to a head, and I was the one who was I was the lower rank, so I lost in a sense from the outer perspective. And so I had to admit I had been wrong. And I came to a point actually where I came to a point where I said, I'm not going to defend myself. I'm just going to look at my own psychology. What is it in me that I need to change? And that was a big shift for me. And what I'm saying is we can, of course, all come to that point. And before that, it had been, I've talked about the separate selves. So I had some very strong separate selves that didn't want to ever be wrong. They didn't want me to ever be wrong. And I've explained in my Avatar series how we came to Earth totally innocent, just positive, wanting to do something, and the fallen beings manipulated us into a situation where it seemed like we had been wrong. So based on this, we create this primal self, which basically has this task that we never want to experience a similar situation again. We never want, if it can be different for each one, but for me it was definitely being wrong. I had been wrong. I'd made an unforgivable mistake. And so the primal self's task is, you can never be wrong again. And this means that you have in your conscious mind, you're not aware of all this superstructure you have in the subconscious mind, but you have this very strong, I can't be wrong. I can't be really wrong. I couldn't do something really bad. And then, you grow up in a world that often exposes you to this. You could be wrong. You could be wrong about this. You could be wrong about that. But then you find your first spiritual movement, and now you think, oh, here's my oasis. Here's my Garden of Eden. Now I've come home. I can never be wrong here. And then what happens to a lot of spiritual people is that we either start seeing problems with the guru or with the organization, but we especially start seeing problems with how people are being treated in the organization. And how are people being treated? Well, they're being treated by middle managers who are not treating people right. It's just being unkind, And so many spiritual people have gone through the same. You get in conflict with some of these leaders, and they, of course, don't want to admit they're wrong. If the organizational culture is based on this fear of being wrong, then you can't be a leader and admit you were wrong, because then you might not be a leader anymore, and they become attached to that position. So, by definition, when you come into a spiritual movement, if you question the leaders, you're the one who's wrong. If you question the guru, you're the one who's wrong. If you question the teachings, you're the one who's wrong. If you question the organizational culture, you're the one who's wrong. That's the way it is in any movement that's based on this fear-based approach to the spiritual path. And so many people have gotten into this where you got yourself into a situation, you can't change the outer situation, and in some cases people admit they were wrong, but in other cases people withdraw. And this is what I did for my first spiritual movement. I withdrew from the movement, not admitting that I had done something wrong, because I couldn't bear that at the time. It was too emotional for me. So I had to project that it was the teacher, he was a false teacher, and by the way people were being treated wasn't right either, and all of this stuff. So I had, all these outer reasons, all these outer excuses. And in my second spiritual movement, the same dynamic repeated, because of course I had the same psychology, so how could I not get myself into the same situation? And my second spiritual movement was also had this fear-based aspects to it. And so, but there, I made the shift. I made the shift where I basically said, what's in it for me? Never mind the other people. There are plenty of other people who knew about the situation. There was the particular leader, but there was leaders at higher levels that knew about the situation. And I said, they have the power to change the situation. I don't. I have made them aware of what's going on. If they don't want to change anything, it's really not my karma. Because I have said I've done what I can do from my level. So I decided, okay, let me look at my own reaction. And I realized that and this is a very subtle thing. My outer mind could have very well argued that I was right. There were reasons, there were good enough arguments that my outer mind could have held on to and said I was right. But I, the conscious you, was able to step back from this and say, but maybe I had the right reasons or outer arguments, but maybe my state of mind wasn't right. because I was doing it from a state of mind of wanting to point out a flaw and wanting to point out other people's mistakes. So maybe that wasn't really coming from love. And when I saw this and let go of this, that was a major breakthrough. But what I really wanted to say with this here is that this was where I started shifting. I didn't shift all at once, but I started shifting into realizing that you can't go wrong on the spiritual path. Because you see, my outer mind, again, and I had to wrestle with this for some time, but my outer mind could have said, okay, you were wrong, Kim. You shouldn't have done this. You shouldn't have said anything. You should just kept your mouth shut, not stuck your neck out, not taken a risk here, because you knew what kind of organization this is. So you should have just been quiet. But I was able to avoid that reaction also because I realized if I hadn't done what I did, I wouldn't have been confronted with this in myself, and then I wouldn't have taken that major step forward. You see, if I had done nothing, if I had just been a quiet little mouse, I wouldn't have grown. So I did exactly what I needed to do in order to grow myself and in order to give other people an opportunity to grow. And it really wasn't my responsibility whether they took that opportunity or not. What was my responsibility was that I took my opportunity. And I wasn't wrong for doing this because I turned it into a growing experience. And that's my point. No matter what you have done, whether it's in the spiritual movement or out there in the world, no matter what mistake you have made, you can turn it into a growth experience where you see something in yourself and you free yourself from it because you realize, I am not this. I am not defined by this. I'm a spiritual being. And I have given the model in some of my other talks about the subconscious selves that we create. And when you have that model, it's much easier to simply realize you have all these subconscious selves. And the spiritual path is about gradually, one by one, coming to free yourself from them. Where the conscious you identify, oh, I see that reaction, which I thought was inevitable or was the only way to react, it just comes from a self. And it's not the only way to react. In fact, I don't want to react that way anymore. And so you come to see the self from the outside, and when you see the self, you've separated yourself from it. And then you can make that decision, I'm just letting the self die. And that's what I did in this particular situation. I said, I had some arguments, and I could have continued to argue based on those arguments. But that would have just tied me more to that self. By not doing this, by stepping back and saying, what do I need to see in myself? That's when I separated myself from at least one of these selves and let it go. And this is the process. Once you grasp that process, how could you go wrong? Whatever situation you get yourself into, all it can do is expose a subconscious self that you have. And when you come to see this and let it go, you've taken a major step forward on the path. How was that wrong? And take care of what I'm saying here. On the one hand, we have these selves that want us to never have been wrong. But you have to realize that when you're on the spiritual path, it's not a matter of being right or wrong here on earth. It's a matter of being right on the path. And the right on the path is you identify a separate self, you separate yourself from it, and you let it die. You're not trying to solve the problem. You see, in that situation I'm describing, my subconscious self was saying, you have to get the other people to see you were right. That was the problem it was presenting to me. And I didn't become free of the self. If I'd gone into arguing, I would have been trapped in the self. Didn't become free of the self, and I said, but I'm not going to try and solve that problem. I don't care what the other people think about me and how they react to the situation. I'm only going to look at myself. That is being right with the path. And when you're really on the spiritual path, it's about, as I said, coming to realize you're not defined by anything on earth. And what I mean with that is not the outer conditions. You are not defined by any of these subconscious selves that you have in your emotional, mental, and identity bodies. Now, it's true that the subconscious selves are, of course, based on the outer conditions. I'm this, I'm that, I have to be this way and that way. But coming to disidentify yourself from the selves means you realize all of these outer conditions here on earth, they're unreal. And they don't matter compared to coming closer to oneness with your higher self. Coming closer to freedom from identification with anything on earth. So you could say that your spiritual path is a path of liberating yourself from the illusion that you are identified with or defined by conditions on earth. There is nothing on earth that defines you when you are fully liberated and ready to ascend. I've given the image before of Gautama Buddha sitting under the Bo tree, ready to go into nirvana, and the demons of Mara are tempting him to react. And it's also like Jesus said, the prince of this world cometh and has nothing in me. So you have to come to this point where there's nothing in this world that can pull you into reacting to the world. And that means overcoming all of these subconscious selves, but also kind of shifting your mind where you realize, I'm not defined by anything on earth. And that the entire purpose of the spiritual path is to overcome that identification. So anything that happens, anything that brings up a reaction in you, just gives you an opportunity to see another subconscious self and let it go. Separate yourself from it. And that's why I'm saying, nothing can really be a mistake, because whatever situation is there, by looking at your reaction, you can separate yourself from the self that has the reaction. Because the conscious you, this is what you realize as you go further on the path. Conscious you has no reaction to anything on earth. I said it's pure awareness, but it's also neutral. You may say, you go back to that situation I'm talking about where I had this conflict with this leader. He was saying I was wrong. I was saying that he was wrong for the way he was running the department. So it's a classical example of right and wrong, and most people would say, well, one has to be right and the other has to be wrong. But being in that state of mind is what keeps you tied to something on earth. If you want to be right among men, it keeps you tied. So if you want to be free, you have to say, I want to be right with God, I want to be right with Spirit, I want to be right with my higher self. And that's when you come to this point where you realize nothing on earth really matters compared to my oneness with my higher self. And therefore I can let it go. I don't have to be right. I don't have to prove other people wrong. I don't have to get other people to see things a certain way. I don't have to change other people. I just have to change myself by freeing myself from this identification with these subconscious selves. And once you realize that, it's like an enormous liberation, because you go away from what I call the deficit approach to the spiritual path. And I had the deficit approach to spirituality for several decades. I can't even quite remember when it started. Well, it probably started shifting after that experience I'm talking about, which was in 1988. So, but I still had a lot of the deficit approach that I felt I was behind, I wasn't where I needed to be, I should be doing more, I should be practicing more, studying more, all of this stuff. And I came to a point where I shifted and said, why do I want to feel I'm always behind? Why do I want to feel I'm not good enough? I'm a sincere spiritual student. I'm walking the path. I'm willing to look at myself and my own psychology, willing to work with my own psychology. Why do I need to feel I'm behind, that I'm not good enough, that I'm insufficient? And this was, again, these are just subconscious selves that are projecting this feeling at you. But, as I said in the beginning, there is an enormous beast in the collective consciousness that are also projecting all these feelings. You're not good enough. or you have no right to walk the spiritual path, or you can't leave other people behind when you're walking. All of these beasts are projecting at you that you shouldn't take that next step. You shouldn't overcome this self that they are using as a hook in your consciousness to hold you back. So once you start realizing this, you realize that you can just let it all go. It's all unreal. And so for me, it was very helpful in order to come to that point, there were two things that were helpful. First of all, it was very helpful for me to understand that they are fallen beings and that they are trying to do everything they can to sabotage my progress on my path. They just want to sabotage it. So they want to keep me feeling that I'm not good enough. And when I started realizing that, I came to this point where I just felt this determination in me. They're not going to get me in this lifetime. I'm going to let them manipulate me. So I always had this, and I remember for several years what really helped me was every time I had this projection come at me that I'd made a mistake, I just repeated this mantra from this point forward. Because I realized that it doesn't really matter what happened in the past. What matters is that I go forward from this point by learning from what I did and then taking the next step up. At that time, I didn't have the concept of the selves, but I still felt that I just need to go beyond. I need to learn from what happened instead of sitting around in this mode we go into, and which I went into a lot when I was younger. Of, in your mind, you're going over the whole scenario and you're trying to act it out in different ways so that you come out looking okay in the end. You're arguing and you're this and that. You can just go on and on and on and spend so much mental energy on this, basically defending yourself. And I just, came to the point where I was better at dropping that, not being so caught up in it. I could let it go sooner. So this was one thing, the fallen beings aren't going to get me. And I started realizing what they do to pull us down. But the other thing was the Ascended Masters. Now, I said that back in 1984 was really when I realized what Ascended Masters are. But still back then I had somewhat of a, what do you want to call it, colored image of them. And in my second spiritual movement, there was actually this culture that was the fear-based. It was almost like the angry God in the sky that was transferred to the Ascended Masters. That the Ascended Masters were these very strict disciplinarians who, it was not really that they were going to send us to hell or punish us, but they certainly wanted to point out when we had made a mistake, when we hadn't passed our test. So it was seen as devastating if the masters saw your mistakes or pointed out your mistakes. And there came a point where I realized that, but wait a minute now, the Ascended Masters are in the spiritual realm. They see everything, don't they? I mean, whatever I do, they see it. I can't hide anything from the Ascended Masters. And I realized, I had this epiphany, I realized that it's so naive to think that what you can hide from other people is also hidden from spiritual beings. They see everything. They see my thoughts, my feelings. What can I hide from them? So at that point I realized, well, why would I want to hide something from them? And I realized it can only be my ego. Again, I didn't have the concept of separate selves back then, but it can only be my ego wants to hide something. But why would I want to hide something? Because what are the Ascended Masters here for? They are here to help me grow. And how do they help me grow? By helping me see something in myself. At that point, I had really looked into what this path is all about, seeing something in my own psychology. So it's a matter of, the Ascended Masters, they don't want to make us feel guilty. They don't want to make us feel ashamed. They just want to help us see what can make us free. And I realized also, partly because I experienced, of course, the Master's presence, and I realized that they love us, each and every one of us, but their love is not human love. At the time I saw it as unconditional. Now I would say it's beyond conditions. All of the conditions that people put up on earth for love, if you love somebody, they have to live up to this or that condition. All of this stuff that doesn't apply to the Ascended Masters. And I felt this, when I opened myself up to this, I felt this unconditional love from the Ascended Masters for me personally. And of course, they have the same for you. They have it for all people. And I realized at some point that, taking this fear-based image of the angry God in the sky and transferring to the Ascended Masters, it was really completely out of touch with reality. It was just completely out of touch with my experience, my direct experience of the Ascended Masters. And I'm not saying that to make it seem like I had some special experience you can't have. You can have the same experience. You just need to open yourself to it and not reject the love because you think that you have to live up to conditions. See, this is what's projected at us from the fallen beings, from the false teachers. That in order to receive love from the spiritual realm, we have to live up to all of these conditions here on earth. But what have I just said the spiritual path is about? It's about freeing ourselves from all these conditions. And when we free ourselves from conditions, we naturally start experiencing the love that the Ascended Masters have for us, because it's beyond conditions. It's not contingent upon conditions. It's like they're constantly radiating this love towards us. It's not a matter of, is the love being sent to us, or do we live up to the conditions? No. The only matter is, do we receive the love or not? And if we have conditions in our minds, then we can't receive the unconditional love. We're just rejecting it. And so when I realized this, I could start letting go. And this took some time, of course, but I could let go of this image that the Ascended Masters are here to punish me. They are only here to help me be free, just like they have become free. Because once you unite with the one mind, you just want other people to be free as well. And so this was a very important step for me, very important for me to feel this from the Ascended Masters. But you can actually feel this, and you don't necessarily have to go through the Ascended Masters, because as I've explained in other videos, there is the first thing that the Creator created before it started creating form was the one mind that cannot be divided. And every form, including ourselves, is created out of the one mind. So the one mind is everywhere. The one mind is in everything. And what is the one mind? Well, it's again this unconditional love is one way to describe it. It's a love that is beyond conditions. It's really oneness, you could say. It's really oneness beyond conditions. And it only seeks to give us that sense of being in oneness. But for many people, when you have the sense of oneness, it will be experienced as love, as this very, very totally unconditional love. And so there is actually an important, there's really an important aspect of this from the Christian religion, which I wasn't really brought up in the Christian religion, but I don't think most mainstream Christian churches really understand this either, because they're also fear-based. But the reality of Jesus, when you look at his real teachings, it was this, again, the one mind, or the Christ consciousness, the Buddha nature, whatever you want to call it, is beyond any conditions on earth. Conditions are what takes us away from oneness. And the one mind wants to bring us back to oneness by helping us see that all of these conditions are unreal. This is not who we are. They don't define us. And this means that the one mind is set up to forgive everything we could possibly done, every mistake we could possibly make. That's really the essence behind this idea that Christ forgives sins. Many people think this is an outer thing. You have done something to sin. But it's not really that what you have done with the body. It's the conditions you have created in your mind that you think define you. That's the sin, if you really want to talk about sin. So the whole idea is that the Christ mind, the one mind, can wash away all of your sins, all of this false identity. But how does it do it? It doesn't do it for you. It's not as some external force that comes and does this for you, like Christians think Jesus is going to come back and forgive all the sins of all the good Christians and take them to heaven. That's not how it works. It works from within, because the one mind gives you this frame of reference. I am more than this. Whatever it is you are encountering on earth, I'm more than this. I can just let it go. I don't need to solve any problem here. I don't need to fix anything. I don't need to change anything on earth before I can let go. I can just let go. And this is actually what's outpictured by Jesus being crucified. Because Jesus is hanging there on the cross. And at first he's thinking, and he's even saying at some point that he could command God to send his angels to free him from this. So he's actually thinking that somehow God is going to manifest a miracle that's going to free him from this crucified position. But then he realizes that that's not going to happen. And that's when, in a moment of anguish, he cries out, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Because that's what it feels like to him. But this is actually all out playing in his own mind, because that he had one last subconscious self that had a certain image of God, that God was going to come and save him. And what Jesus then realizes, that he has to let go of that self, that final self, that's the final self he has left. He has to let go of that. And that's when he, as it says in the Bible, he gave up the ghost of that last subconscious self. And then he was free. His body dies, yes, but he's free. His being, his conscious you, is free to ascend and become an ascended master. And that's the whole power of this Christ the Redeemer. The one mind, the Christ mind, the Buddha nature, whatever you want to call it. But there is that mind that can redeem us of anything we have ever done on earth. Any mistake you could possibly have made in this lifetime or in any past lifetime. The one mind can redeem you from it. And you are washed clean. But you have to accept this. It's not going to do it for you. It's not going to force you. You have to accept it. And how can you accept it? By letting go of these subconscious selves that are screaming at you not to accept this. They will scream at you, no, you can't just let go. What he's telling you is a lie. It's a false teaching. You have to live up to these conditions. Just look at this religion. Just look at this spiritual teaching. Just look at how they define. You have to fulfill all of these requirements. You have to walk this difficult path and pass all of these initiations. You have to have all these signs of enlightenment. You can't just let go. That's what they'll say. This is what they'll project, and they're projecting this at you right now. Have you noticed? Have you noticed any stirring up of your feelings? Any arguments coming up? It can't be right. It can't be that simple. Well, it is that simple, but it's not simple, because as long as you have these selves, you can't accept it. And all I'm saying here is, I'm not saying that you can switch instantly and let go of all these selves. This is a process. It takes time. For God's sake, it took me over 40 years. Maybe I'm slow. Hopefully I'm slow. But nevertheless, it will take time. And so, but if you at least know what is the goal of the process and the method for completing the process, you are way ahead of most people on the spiritual path. And you can use this, whatever reaction is coming up in you as you're watching this video, you can use it if you're willing to look at yourself and say, what kind of a subconscious self do I have that this reaction is coming from, that's projecting this reaction at me? And for some it might be fear, it might be guilt, it might be a sense of embarrassment, it might be all kinds of different individual reactions. But all they do is they're exposing, there's a subconscious self. And if you're willing to look at it and work on it, you can use this to take a major step forward. Then there might be other subconscious self. But again, you keep going, and there will come a point where you're free of the subconscious selves. But there will also come a point where you have freed yourself enough from these selves that you're no longer identified with them. So if another self comes up, you're not pulled into it. You're not really identified with it. You can see, oh, there's a reaction here. Let me just step outside and look at it. Instead of being pulled into it and being all enveloped in it. And it becomes a lot easier to walk the path that way when you realize that the path is really only about one thing. Gradually coming to the point where nothing in this world defines you. It doesn't mean you have to forsake the world. It doesn't mean you have to hate the world or look down on the world as an enemy of your spiritual growth. The world is an opportunity for your spiritual growth because it causes you to react. And by reacting, you can see what it is in yourself that makes you think you have to react or you have to react a certain way. And this is what gradually brings to that point, as I've said before about the ascension point. There comes that point. You are ready to ascend. You have let go of the subconscious selves. But you have to take that long, last look back at Earth and realize, if I walk through that door to the ascended realm, I'm going to leave the Earth behind forever. I'm not going to come back into embodiment. There's nothing I can do on Earth. When I walk through that door, nothing I can do, physically. And you have to then have no self that's pulling you into saying, oh, but I should have done this. I must be here to see this change through. We must get rid of war. We must get rid of poverty. We must solve this problem. We must solve that problem. If you have any of this, this is a subconscious self. Then you're not ready to ascend, and that's fine. If you don't want to ascend, that's okay. But what I'm saying is the only way to really be free, ultimately be free on the spiritual path, is that you can look back at Earth and nothing pulls you. The prince of this world has nothing in you. The demons of Mara have nothing in you. Because there is nothing in you. You are back to that state of innocence with which the conscious you descended. That's when you can leave. Until you are completely free of anything on earth pulling on you, you can't leave. And you can come up with all kinds of ideas. Oh, if I walk the spiritual path, if I follow these requirements, if I do what this guru tells me, then surely I can leave. But you can't. It has to be a free choice, but you can't make the free choice until you have no subconscious selves that are pulling you to solve any problem on earth. So this was a lot longer than I thought it was going to be. Come to think of it, they usually are. But I hope it has been helpful to you and that you can use it for something on your spiritual path. And I hope, first of all, it can give you a better experience of your spiritual path. Because once you let go of this fear of failure, the spiritual path just becomes completely enjoyable. It's just, for me, looking back, I can see that for many decades I was in this fear of failure. But when I let go of that, ever since then, it's been a fantastic adventure. And it's just been so enjoyable. And I even look back at it today with no regrets whatsoever, because I realized, well, that was just the state of mind I was in. But walking the path, even though it was harder back then, it was still worth it, because I am where I am today. I'm free today of all this nonsense. I'm not saying I'm totally free of everything, but I'm certainly much more free than I was when I started. And it's been so enjoyable, especially the last 20, 25 years. It's just been so enjoyable to walk the path and interact with the Ascended Masters and feel their presence and feel that unconditional love that they have for each and every one of us. And I really hope that you will also come to the point where you can open yourself to that love, because it is being offered to you right now. Any moment, the Masters are there offering that love to you, and all it takes is to open. But of course, that also means you have to come to see and let die those selves that are preventing you from opening yourself to unconditional love.